For at least one Canadian premier, Barack Obama's State of the Union address crossed a very important line and pushed the debate over the Keystone XL Pipeline project to a new, much more tense level. The line has to do with climate change.
For the sake of our children and our future, we must do more to combat climate change. I urge this Congress to get together, pursue a bipartisan, market-based solution to climate change. But if Congress won't act soon to protect future generations, I will.
So was Barack Obama actually sending a signal not only to Republicans in Congress, but to Canadians to get on board with his climate change plans or be left in the cold on some key initiatives? The next day on Power and Politics, I asked the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Jacobson, about that and what it all could mean for Canada.
The message that the president is sending is a message to the American people, to the American Congress. He is not talking to Canada when he gives the State of the Union. Obviously, there are things about our policy that have significant impact on Canada, but you have to keep in mind he's talking about policy in the United States.
Or was he? Those comments did not reassure Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall. Why not? Let's find out. He joins me now on the line. Premier Wall, good morning and welcome to the House.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on again.
One of the signatures of President Barack Obama's State of the Union address was the section on climate change. What did you make of it, and what do you think it means for Canada?
Well, I think there was some sort of back-channeling or background information ahead of the State of the Union, and then since with some of the comments from the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, who was pretty clear that he wasn't trying to link Keystone approval with some sort of change in Canadian domestic policy. And yet that's sort of what's been left in the air a little bit. That's been the inference. And I think we should be concerned about this, Evan, not because it's an environmental issue or it's Keystone specifically, but imagine how Canadians would feel if a Bush White House would have at least inferred, or officials close to a Bush White House would have inferred, look, we might approve some important Canadian project if you would just change your domestic policy to be more in line with what we want. I think people would be apoplectic, and rightfully so. And so I think Keystone needs to be approved on a prima facie basis. Is it good or is it bad based on the test that the Americans will apply?
But where are you getting these inferences, just so Canadians get an appreciation? Yeah. Where are you getting the inferences that Keystone approval is tied to policy change vis-a-vis climate?
Well, to be fair, the ambassador in his comments that led to, I think there was an editorial in the Globe and Mail that was expressed some concern that this was happening at least on a de facto basis. To be fair to the ambassador, he expressly said, look, we're not linking the two, and I'm not linking the two, but I think it was another well-known Canadian pundit, also with that paper, who was on some networks, you're wondering about whether this is a coincidence, because they are talking about sort of sending out the hint that wouldn't it be helpful if Canada made some changes or did some things with respect to the environment and the energy and the confluence of those two sectors in terms of policy to help along to give some quote-unquote cover to the president to approve the thing. I just think that should concern us all. Again, Keystone should be approved or not approved on its face. And you don't see the Americans even heading down this road from any other supplier of its oil. Imagine, I have never heard them say or infer that it would be really nice if, say, Saudi Arabia would provide full human rights protection for women. For example, let women get a driver's license if they wanted their oil to move successfully into U.S. ports. So I just think we should be, as Canadians, concerned and seeking clarification on this particular issue, regardless of how we feel about Keystone. There's a bigger principle here. One other point, if I can make it, Evan. I mean, I'm not sure if there's another jurisdiction in North America that actually has priced carbon than Alberta, and BC, of course, has its carbon tax. And this is important. California has done some measures, I understand that. But if the president, if the U.S. administration is saying, look, we want Canada to catch up in terms of in greenhouse gas policy, even in Saskatchewan, we have greenhouse gas legislation. We're moving towards that levy that Alberta has and creation of a fund so we can invest in technology to reduce CO2 footprint around energy production. We always can be doing more and need to do a better job on the mitigation of CO2, but our record is something we should be promoting if it's the understanding of the American Americans that somehow we're behind. I'd argue the opposite. Just in Saskatchewan, in terms of the largest clean coal project in the world, on time and on budget, and we'll go live with it here shortly. We're into that project for about $1,400 worth of public investment per man, woman, and child in our province, $1.4 billion. So there is a real effort on the part of Canadians and the part of governments and companies, and we need to do more. But I think we have a communications challenge here to get this message out stateside.
But are you suggesting that part of the message that has come out of the State of the Union is that the U.S. president and maybe inferences from the ambassador are essentially meddling in Canadian domestic policy in exchange for something on that Keystone Pipeline, which is a place they don't belong? Is that what you're saying?
I am saying we ought to be concerned about it, and we ought to seek clarification. I've written to the ambassador. I think the letter went just yesterday. We sent it off right away. And
what did you ask him?
Well, we just asked for clarification. We did give him the full credit for saying that there was no link, and he wasn't linking these things. But all of this is happening right around the State of the Union. There just seems to be a lot of buzz, and I think that's enough for Canadians to at least be concerned. Let's just get a clear statement that, look, these two things are separate, the Keystone and whatever North America is going to do with respect to energy and environmental policy.
You've been a big proponent of the Keystone XL Pipeline project, but the federal Environment Minister Peter Kent and previous ones have said Canada will align its environmental policies with the U.S. We've done it on regulations. If they move to a cap and trade, maybe Canada would do it. We're not going to do it alone. Wouldn't it make sense if aligning environmental policies with the U.S. helped greenlight the Keystone XL Pipeline? Doesn't it make sense to do it?
Oh, I just think that's quite a precedent to set. Again, let's think about it in terms of a president, of another president, or another administration, or even another policy area, say foreign policy. I think this is a dangerous road to go down where there's even the inference or the notion that approval of a project important to our country is going to be contingent on some change in some basically U.S. or foreign directed change in domestic policy. And I know that everybody's running away from that right now, saying, no, that's not what was meant. But I think we need to seek we need to seek clarification. One other final point: I think it's incumbent on us to make sure in our country that we are also letting all the information out about Keystone. 100,000 barrels a day in that pipeline will be back in light sweet crude from the Bakken Formation in North Dakota and Montana. This is important in terms of North American energy security. It's not just about the oil sands.
But it's become a big political football. Tomorrow in Washington, there'll be a huge protest against Keystone. You know, Obama has made climate change a big part of his second term. You know he's got big political pressure from his own Democratic base about Keystone. It's been suggested, for example, if the U.S. moves ahead, they've got to move ahead on something, cap and trade, a carbon tax. What would you support as a next step?
Well, we support something we call cap and cut. We've passed our greenhouse gas regulations in our province, and what we've done is set up a fund, a technology fund, wherein those who exceed their emissions limits will have to pay a per ton levy into the fund, and that fund can be used to actually innovate and reduce the CO2. What we've been concerned about CO2 or just a carbon tax because these things can tend to be wealth transfers and actually not deal with the problem. They can tend to be more about taxes and less about the environment. As I mentioned, we're spending $1.4 billion on the world's largest clean coal demonstration project in southeast Saskatchewan. It is going to it's going to capture 97%. That's the capture rate. It's going to be comparable in price to natural gas, and it's potentially a game changer. And we're making a public investment there. Now, maybe we in Canada haven't made the case that our private sector and public sectors are working on these investments to do our part, but I promise you this, our country and our companies are doing more than the other sources of oil. Nigerian oil that comes into the U.S. has a huge CO2 footprint when it lands. You don't see these same kinds of protests. Venezuela's close. Saudi Arabia, in that case of a lot of Middle Eastern countries, again, in terms of policy in countries where they're importing oil, that might be an anathema to Americans, consider the human rights record of some of these Middle Eastern countries. So where are the protests about that, is my question. And I would say that we need to have done a better job in terms of Keystone and our own environmental record, which isn't perfect, but it's improving and better than almost, I would argue, any other country from which they're purchasing oil.
I got to talk to you about the Senate before I let you go because there are so many questions.
Is that thing still around?
Yes, it is. And it's making headlines. And a senator from your province, Senator Pam Wallen, has been in those headlines, as you know. She's appointed to represent your province. What do you make of the recent controversies about primary residence, about travel expenses, and about transparency with the federal Senate?
Whether it's the Senate or the House of Commons or our own legislature, I think taxpayers have a right to know where and how money is spent, period. And I'm not commenting on any specific case, obviously. And I think that's reasonable for any arm of government, whether it's elected or unelected, in this case an upper chamber or the House of Commons or a provincial legislature. I would also say this, that I think that now is the time for Canada to have a real discussion about the Senate. In our province, we have legislation to elect senators. Personally, I've said publicly that I'm leaning increasingly more towards abolishing the Senate as the appropriate policy, because to me we have the de facto Triple E Senate in the provincial capitals. As we've seen devolution of influence to the provinces are on the front line of program delivery, and provincial capitals can provide that balance.
What about abolishing the Senate? That's a big step. The NDP want to do it, but do you talk to, for example, Premier Giz from PEI? That might be a bigger issue there, or in Quebec.
There's less interest in certain jurisdictions about any constitutional change, but we've had the discussion informally. I've been at those. Typically, they happen when we're having lunch and we're off agenda, and we start chatting about issues. And I've been there for discussions either at Western Premiers meetings or at the Council of the Federation, where we talk a little bit about the Senate. I think Senator Siegel yesterday or Thursday perhaps, was musing about a referendum. That's an option, perhaps. People may have had enough. I don't know. But if they do decide that, if Canadians were given the chance to decide it and to decide the Senate's future and decided against the future for the Senate, we ought not to fear, because we have the balance. I think the check and balance in this federation has become the provincial capitals. And we have a voice for the provinces and for the regions in those capitals. It's not necessarily needed in the Senate.
Premier Wall, great to have you on the program. Thanks.
Thanks for your time. Have a good weekend.
You too.